NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. The leaders gathered today for their first face-to-face talks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine exactly 1 month ago. They hope the extraordinary show of unity by NATO and the G7 and the EU will send a clear message to Russian Vladimir Putin. President Biden is now at the podium. Let's take a listen.
I'm very tired. Am I the 16th or 17th? At any rate, all kidding aside, thank you for taking the time. Today marks 1 month since Russia began its carnage in Ukraine, the brutal invasion of Ukraine. And we held a NATO summit the very next day. At that time, my overwhelming objective in wanting that summit was to have absolute unity on three key important issues among our NATO and European allies. First was to support Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance. Second was to impose the most significant sanctions, economic sanction regime ever, in order to cripple Putin's economy and punish him for his actions. Third was to fortify the eastern flank of our NATO allies, who were obviously very, very concerned and somewhat worried what would happen. We accomplished all three of these. And today, we're determined to sustain those efforts and to build on them. The United States is committed to provide over $2 billion in military equipment to Ukraine since I became president: anti-air systems, anti-armor systems, ammunition, and our weapons are flowing into Ukraine as I speak. And today, I'm announcing the United States is prepared to commit more than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to help get relief to millions of Ukrainians affected by the war in Ukraine. Many Ukrainian refugees will wish to stay in Europe, closer to their homes. But we also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States with a focus on reuniting families. And we will invest $320 million to bolster democratic resilience and defend human rights in Ukraine and neighboring countries. We're also coordinating with the G7 and the European Union on food security as well as energy security. And I'll have more to say about that tomorrow. We're also announcing new sanctions of more than 400 individuals and entities in alignment with the European Union. More than 300 members of the Duma, oligarchs, and Russian defense companies that fuel the Russian war machine. In addition to the 100,000 U.S. forces now stationed in Europe to defend NATO territory, NATO established, as you already know, 4 new battle groups in Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia to reinforce the Eastern Front. Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine. We've built that same unity with the European Union and with the leading democracies of the G7, So I want to thank you, and I'll be now happy to take your questions. Since there's so many people out there, been given a list. Now, how about Chris of the Associated Press? First question.
Hi, thank you, Mr. President. So you've warned about the real threat of chemical weapons being used. Have you gathered specific intelligence that suggests that President Putin is deploying these weapons, moving them to position, or considering their use? And would the U.S. or NATO respond with military action if he did use chemical weapons?
You know, on the first question, I can't answer that. I'm not going to give you intelligence data, number one. Number two, we would respond. We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use. Josh of Bloomberg.
Perhaps I'll just project, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
If I had your voice, I'd have been elected a lot earlier.
I'll give it a try. He's got a long arm. Thank you. Can you talk to us about two things, sir? One, since your conversation with President Xi of China, have you seen any indications of action or lack of action from China that has led you to believe whether they will intervene and help Russia, either with the sale of arms or the provision of supplies to support this war in Ukraine? And secondly, can you say whether the conversation today turned to the subject of food shortages and what the U.S. will do to address wheat shortages in particular as a result of this war? Thank you.
On the first question relating to President Xi Jinping of China, I had a very straightforward conversation with Xi now, I guess it's 6 days ago, 7 days ago, in that range. And I made it clear to him, I made no threats, but I made it clear to him that make sure he understood the consequences of him helping Russia, as had been reported and as what it was expected. And I made no threats, but I pointed out the number of American and foreign corporations that left Russia as a consequence of their barbaric behavior. And I indicated that I knew how much he, because we had long discussions in the past about his interest in making sure he had economic relations and economic growth with Europe and the United States, and indicated that he'd be putting himself at significant jeopardy in those aims if, in fact, he were to move forward. I am not going to comment on any detail about what we know or don't know as a consequence of that conversation. But tomorrow or next Monday that Ursula's having that conference with China? The 1st, on April 1st. We've had discussions because I think that China understands that its economic future is much more closely tied to the West than it is to Russia. And so I'm hopeful that he does not get engaged. We also did discuss today that there's a need for us to set up, NATO to set up, and the EU, to set up a system whereby we have an organization looking at who has violated any of the sanctions and where and when and how they violated them. And that's something we're going to put in train. It's not done yet. So with regard to Xi, I have nothing more to report. With regard to food shortage, yes, we did talk about food shortages. And it's going to be real. The price of these sanctions is not just imposed upon Russia. It's imposed upon an awful lot of countries as well, including European countries and our country as well. And because both Russia and Ukraine have been the breadbasket of Europe in terms of wheat, for example, just to give you one example. But we had a long discussion in the G7 with both the United States, which has a significant, the third largest producer of wheat in the world, as well as Canada, which is also a major producer. And we both talked about how we could increase and disseminate more rapidly food shortages. And in addition to that, we talked about urging all the European countries and everyone else to end trade restrictions on sending limitations on sending food abroad. And so we are in the process of working out with our European friends what it would take to help alleviate the concerns relative to food shortages. We also talked about a significant major U.S. investment, among others, in terms of providing for the need for humanitarian assistance, including food, as we move forward. Tarina of the Wall Street Journal. Watch out, you don't get hit in the head there now.
Mr. President, in your view, does President Zelensky need to cede any Ukrainian territory in order to gain a ceasefire with Russia, or is that completely off the table? And then also, do you think that Russia needs to be removed from the G20?
On the latter point, my answer is yes. That depends on the G20. That was raised today, and I raised the possibility, if that can't be done, if Indonesia and others do not agree, then we should, in my view, ask to have both Ukraine be able to attend the meetings, as well as basically Ukraine being able to attend the G20 meeting and observe. With regard to, what was the first question?
If you think that Ukraine needs to cease, to give up any territory in order to get a ceasefire.
That is a total judgment based on Ukraine. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. I don't believe that they're going to have to do that, but that's a judgment. There's negotiations, that are discussions, I should say, that have taken place that I have not been part of, including the Ukrainians, and it's their judgment to make. Cecilia, ABC. There you are.
Oh, so looking that way, thank you. Sir, you've made it very clear in this conflict that you do not want to see World War III. But is it possible that in expressing that so early that you were too quick to rule out direct military intervention in this war? Could Putin have been emboldened knowing that you are not going to get involved directly in this conflict?
No and no.
You do not believe that? And to clarify on chemical weapons, if chemical weapons were used in Ukraine, would that trigger a military response from NATO?
It would trigger a response in kind. Whether or not you're asking whether NATO would cross, we'd make that decision at the time.
And my final question, because you're heading to Poland tomorrow, do you think that getting a firsthand look at the effects of this war on these millions of Ukrainians who have fled their country could change the way that you might respond?
I don't think so, because I've been to many, many war zones. I've been in refugee camps. I've been in war zones for the last 15 years, and it's devastating. But the thing you look at the most is you see these young children. You see children without parents that are in those camps or in refugees. You see women and husbands, men and women who are completely lost and have no nose. You see the look, that blank look on their face, that absolute feeling of, my God, where am I? What's going to happen to me? And so what it will do, it will reinforce my commitment to have the United States make sure we are a major piece of dealing with the relocation of all those folks, as well as humanitarian assistance needed both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. For example, this is not something that Poland or Romania or Germany should carry on their own. This is an international responsibility. The United States, as a leader, one of the leaders in the international community, has an obligation to be engaged and do all we can to ease the suffering and pain of innocent women and children and men, for that matter, throughout Ukraine, and those who have made it across the border. I plan on attempting to see those folks, as well as I hope I'm going to be able to see, I guess I'm not supposed to say where I'm going, am I? But anyway, I hope I get to see a lot of people. Marcus at Der Spiegel.
Thanks, Mr. President. There's a presidential election coming up in 2024, and as you know,
kidding.
there are yes, that's true. And there are widespread concerns in Europe that a figure like your predecessor, maybe even your predecessor himself, might get elected president again. Are there any steps, anything you're trying to do and NATO is trying to do here these days to prevent what you're trying to do becoming undone 2 years from now? Thank you.
No, that's not how I think of this. I've been dealing with foreign policy for longer than anybody that's involved in this process right now. I have no concerns about the impact. I made a commitment when I ran this time. I wasn't going to run again, and I mean that sincerely. I had no intention of running for president again. And until I saw those folks coming out of the fields in Virginia carrying torches and carrying Nazi banners and literally singing the same vile rhyme that they used in Germany in the early 20s, or 30s, I should say. And then when the gentleman you mentioned was asked what he thought, and a young woman was killed, a protester, And he was asked what he thought. He said, "There are very good people on both sides." And that's when I decided I wasn't going to be quiet any longer. And when I ran this time, and I think the American press, whether they look at me favorably or unfavorably, will acknowledge this, I made a determination. Nothing is worth, no election is worth my not doing exactly what I think is the right thing. Not a joke. I'm too long in the tooth to fool with this any longer. And so we're a long way off in elections, a long way off. My focus, if any election, is on making sure that we retain the House and the United States Senate so that I have the room to continue to do the things that I've been able to do in terms of grow the economy and deal in a rational way with American foreign policy and lead the world, be the leader of the free world. So, but it's not an illogical question for someone to ask. I say to people at home, imagine if we sat and watched the doors of the Bundestag broken down and police officers killed and hundreds of people storming in. Or imagine if we saw that happening in the British Parliament or whatever. How would we feel? And one of the things that I take some solace from is I don't think you'll find any European leader who thinks that I am not up to the job. And I mean that sincerely. It's not like, whoa, it's that. The point is that when the first G7 meeting I attended, like the one I did today, was in Great Britain. And I sat down and I said, America's back. And one of my counterparts, colleagues, as head of state, said, for how long? For how long? And so I don't blame, I don't criticize anybody for asking that question. But the next election, I'd be very fortunate if I had that same man running against me. Thank you very, very much.
Mr. President,
Whoa. No. Yeah, one final question, right. Hey, look, wait, hold on a second, please. I was supposed to be an hour ago at the European Union meeting and to speak. No, and I'm thanking you. So someone I haven't called on before. You. Who are you?
I'm Christina Rafini from CBS. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Sir, deterrence didn't work. What makes you think Vladimir Putin will alter course based on the action you've taken today?
Let's get something straight. You remember, if you covered me from the very beginning, I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter. You keep talking about that. Sanctions never deter. The maintenance of sanctions, the increasing the pain, and the demonstration why I asked for this NATO meeting today is to be sure that after a month we will sustain what we're doing, not just next month, the following month, but for the remainder of this entire year. That's what will stop him.
Do you believe the actions today will have an impact on making Russia change course in Ukraine?
That's not what I said. You're playing a game with me. I know. The answer is no. I think what happens is we have to demonstrate the purpose. The single most important thing is for us to stay unified. And the world continue to focus on what a brute this guy is. And all the innocent people's lives are being lost and ruined and what's going on. That's the important thing. But look, if you're Putin and you think that that Europe is going to crack in a month or 6 weeks or 2 months, why not? They can take anything for another month, but we have to demonstrate. The reason I asked for the meeting, we have to stay fully, totally, thoroughly united. Thank you.
CBS correspondent Christina Rafini getting that last question into President Biden. History will record that before this invasion of Ukraine began, several administration officials representing the President of the United States, Joseph Biden, said, in fact, sanctions might deter that invasion. The President just said, again, emphatically, they don't deter. What they do is they sustain pressure over time, hoping to achieve a different result. Ed O'Keefe, our White House correspondent, is outside NATO headquarters, joins us now. Ed, your thoughts?
Well, you make a good point there that, yes, in the lead up to all of this, administration officials had said this was designed to deter, and the story has changed since they were enacted. Big day of diplomacy here for the president. He's been to 2 of the 3 meetings he was scheduled to attend. They moved the 3rd one to later in the day here in Europe in order to get this press conference in at an earlier hour, and a host of big announcements today so far. Sanctions on at least 400 more Russian officials, including most of Russia's parliament, plus 40 Russian defense companies. Plans to admit 100,000 Ukrainians as refugees into the United States, exceeding the Biden administration's cap on refugees, but that being done in an acknowledgement of the humanitarian crisis that this continent now faces. And you heard the president mention talk about food security and economic assistance that's going to be needed not only here in Europe, but increasingly we've heard warnings from the Middle East and North Africa. People may not realize this, but Ukraine is actually one of this continent's biggest agricultural exporters, especially of wheat. And countries in other parts of the world that rely on those exports have warned if Ukraine cannot push out its yield, send it to other parts of the world, there could be a humanitarian and a food crisis in those parts. So that was part of the conversation today as well. But also, this was a president, as he acknowledged, who's done a little bit of this in the past as a senator and as vice president, and has been eager in the past year to meet face-to-face with these leaders to try to talk through some of the hypotheticals and the questions that he was asked regarding chemical and biological weapons, and at what point might NATO have to engage. And so he gets to do that today, and of course it will continue tomorrow and Saturday in Poland.
And it's a fair observation that many Americans have grown inspired by the leadership of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He has been a constant presence one way or another with everyone who's at that meeting at NATO headquarters, and he has been involved presently. Describe that.
He was there earlier today virtually in the meetings held by NATO leaders first, and notably did not repeat his requests to join NATO and did not ask again for a no-fly zone. Ukrainian diplomats here in Brussels we spoke with this week say they know that's a naive request at this point and a non-starter because the alliance and the United States have determined it might spark World War III. But he did once again implore them to move quickly to send military aid and money, and that collectively this alliance needs to work faster to provide assistance, because if it doesn't to Ukraine, he warned the crisis will spread to Poland, to other Eastern European countries, and then it might present the gravest test yet of the Article 5 charter to NATO that says an attack on one country in this group is an attack on all. That charter has only been invoked once before, after the September 11th attacks. Zelensky now again warning Europe, you may have to invoke it again soon if Putin invades. There's no other world leader, Major, right now who could go around the world in this virtual way, lecturing other parliaments and legislatures, even the Pope, and saying you're not doing enough to help, you need to pick up the pace. But Zelensky did it again today, and it resulted in a joint statement from NATO saying that much more security aid is coming to Ukraine.
Also part of this conversation, Ed, is China, what it does not do. The president was asked about that, and he described with a little bit more detail than I've heard him mention before about that conversation about a week ago with Chinese President Xi, where he said he made no threats, but he reminded him that China has a great number of business and economic and trade relationships that touch America and that touch Europe. And if it doesn't do the right thing in terms of Ukraine, those could be, in the president's words, jeopardized. That seemed to me to shine more light than we've seen before.
You're right. He doesn't speak often that publicly or too expansively about China. This seems to be the one relationship where he knows less can be much more. But what he signaled there is that China seems to have an understanding that should it get too close to Russia, should it provide too much support, its economy and its reliance on the Western world could be at risk. And so by once again saying he's not going to detail too much, I think he's leaving the door open. And administration officials have signaled this for China to, as they said to our Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation last week, continue to keep the lines of communication open with Russia, but not necessarily embrace them as much as people might have feared. And yet also saying that condemning the situation in Ukraine is naive and something that they don't necessarily feel they need to do. So by keeping them at least in the loop, and we know there were conversations today about what exactly China should be doing in response to all of this, there's an understanding that they too can play a big role in this. We should also point out, Major, the Prime Minister of Japan was at this meeting today because of the meetings with the G7. President Biden and the Japanese Prime Minister did discuss this apparent missile launch earlier today by North Korea that the Japanese and South Koreans have warned was far different and much more dramatic and ambitious than any that's been conducted since 2017. The U.S. Saying that they're continuing to assess the situation, called it provocative, and alongside the Japanese Prime Minister, they agreed this is something that also has to be addressed. So all sorts of crises being addressed here in Brussels as these meetings continue.
No doubt. Ed O'Keefe outside of NATO headquarters in Brussels. Please stay there for just one moment. I want to turn our attention now to CBS News foreign correspondent Deborah Pata, who is in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Deborah, what can you tell us?
Major Garrett, well, here in Kyiv, the Ukrainians are mounting a very plucky defense, trying to repel the Russian advance on the capital. In fact, they've managed to push them back in Irpin, which was the scene, you'll recall, of very, very heavy fighting in the past few weeks, but they've managed to put them and halt them for now. But further down southeast at the port city of Berdyansk, the Ukrainians also claim that they managed to destroy a Russian landing ship. And this ship was touted by the Russian television last week as being an epic event. It was bringing in resources, much needed supplies. We know that the Russian forces are running short on supplies and on fuel and even armored vehicles. But they say that they've managed to blow that up. But it's still a fierce, fierce battle. Mariupol is being decimated just nearby. And here in Kyiv, we spent the day at a children's hospital, and even the doctors and the nursing staff there were saying, we don't need medicine. What we need is military weapons and support from America and other countries. So the billion-dollar package that President Biden mentioned, of course, will be welcomed. The humanitarian aid will be welcomed here. There is a desperate need for that as the crisis continues to grow and more people flee from the fighting. But what they're saying they really need, that's not enough, is military support. They need to be able to repel the advances of the Russians. And remember that these doctors and nurses are the people who are seeing the effects of this war every day. One health worker told us, we see war crimes on a daily basis. Children coming in here, blown to pieces as they try and flee the fighting in cars with their parents and get shot at. Missiles are launched at them. They see this every single day, and that is their cry.
Deborah Pata in Kyiv, giving us the eyes and ears and the drumbeat of war in that besieged capital. Thank you very much. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Good day.
And for more on the president's address, we want to bring in Ambassador Thomas Pickering. He served more than 4 decades as a U.S. diplomat. He is the former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and previously served U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation. Ambassador Pickering now serves as the senior counselor at Albright Stonebridge Group. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. This has truly been a united front by NATO. But do you think their effort at this summit will make enough of a difference to change the tide in Ukraine?
It's a very difficult question. So far, Putin has slipped quite badly in meeting his military objectives. Coupled with an increase in NATO support for Ukraine, which the president has announced, as well as pressures on Russia's financial and economic situation, plus a possible serious cut in Russian oil exports, should be the measure of how and in what way Putin should begin to change his mind and move. There are some optimistic reports, maybe over-optimistic, that already the Ukrainians are hearing in their discussions with the Russians some perhaps more comfortable news. But that's early reporting.
Ambassador Pickering, the president addressed conversations he's had with China's Xi Jinping, deterring him from helping Russia. Let's listen to what the president had to say about this.
I made it clear to him. I made no threats, but I made it clear to him that make sure he understood the consequences of him helping Russia, as had been reported and as what it was expected. And I made no threats, but I pointed out the number of American and foreign corporations that left Russia as a consequence of their barbaric behavior. And I indicated that I knew how much he, because we had long discussions in the past about his interest in making sure he had economic relations and economic growth with Europe and the United States, and indicated that he'd be putting himself at significant jeopardy in those aims if, in fact, he were to move forward.
Ambassador, do you think this is the correct tack to approach with China? And are you concerned at all that China may act even with President Biden's warning?
First, I think it is the correct approach. With China, public recriminations get them excited, and engaging in a battle merely hardens their position. The kind of careful warning the president gave over the phone is a very valuable way of proceeding. There's absolutely no guarantee it will produce a perfect solution, and we'll have to wait and see how far China wants to go. But so far it's been sitting more on the fence than it has been crawling over to one side or the other. The president's warning about economic recriminations and economic effects is valuable because China is, of course, heavily tied to its economy, and its economy is heavily tied in to the United States.
And Ambassador, before we let you go, we want to touch on another subject. You knew Madeleine Albright personally. She was a dear friend of yours. We would be honored to hear how you feel about her legacy, what she's leaving behind.
Yes, I had the honor to work for her in the State Department for a number of years, and I thought highly of Madeleine Albright. She was a pioneer and a groundbreaker, someone who never cringed from taking on a tough job and never failed, in my view, to give it her very, very best in everything she took on. She, as a migrant, found herself particularly tied to the U.S. and its interests because she knew the calamity of the U.S. losing its position as a world leader and how it would affect people all around the globe. There was, I think, no one who broke into the State Department the way Madeleine did and opened the door for many other people to follow, including myself, and I am very, very grateful to her for that kind of leadership and for being a wonderful boss.
A true trailblazer. Ambassador Thomas Pickering, thank you so much for joining us. We certainly appreciate your insight. We are joined now by CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Hi, Ed. So what stuck out to you about the president's speech?
Well, I think, again, just the idea now that this collective body, this military alliance, understands that an attack involving chemical or biological weapons is a far more likely scenario than they may have initially feared, because they're talking about it publicly now. We ran into the Turkish president a little while ago in the hallway who said something similar, which is that it isn't my decision alone, but he acknowledged that something may have to be done. And you heard the president say that there will be some kind of a response depending on what exactly Russia does. This could put NATO in a situation that it's not quite been in before, because this obviously is an alliance of a handful of 30 countries in Europe and North America, with various allies here across Europe and in other parts of the world. But Ukraine is not a member. That this is happening next door, however, and in the midst of a continent that is now absorbed by this situation, I think there's a political understanding by these leaders that they can't let it go unanswered. If they are the dominant and predominant military alliance, at least in this part of the world, and it's their eye that the Russian president's trying to poke, in essence, by taking on Ukraine in this way. So by him saying that there's going to have to be a discussion about that, if it happens, is a sign that something likely would come from it. But that also speaks to the frustration that Volodymyr Zelensky again expressed to this group today, that it's taking too long for this alliance to make decisions that need to be made quickly. In his remarks to the group this morning, he essentially said, your might or your reputation is being tested the longer it takes for you to make simple decisions like how many weapons are you sending our way? Where are you deploying troops? Would you be willing to give us aircraft or tanks? He made some point or reference to the idea that there are about 200,000 tanks in the possession of NATO countries, and all he'd like is 1% of them. But that it's taking too long for the alliance to make those kinds of decisions. And instead, he's got to have multiple bilateral conversations with the United States, Germany, the UK, Canada, even the Pope separately to appeal for aid when he'd rather be going to just this location, this organization, to get that done. So, you know, the president, other leaders here made clear they needed to have this conversation in person. They wanted to do it. He's completed 2 of the 3 meetings he's scheduled to have today. He's now headed to what's called the European Council, which is part of the European Union, to continue the discussions with the leaders that could ultimately be most affected by this, both the military aspects of it, but now increasingly the humanitarian aspects of this. The fact that they announced today a collective at least $12 billion in aid for humanitarian relief in the short term, and then for economic and food aid across this continent and other parts of the world is a sign that they now understand, while this may be confined to one country in Eastern Europe, it is quickly mushroomed into a global crisis.
Well, speaking to that point, Ed, the president did announce that another $1 billion in humanitarian aid will help displaced Ukrainians. The U.S. will also accept 100,000 refugees. How significant is that?
That is significant, Meg, because, first of all, the Biden administration had put a cap on how many refugees it was going to admit from the entire world, 125,000 in fiscal year 2022, which is what we're in right now. The administration today says because of this influx of 100,000 that they're going to admit, and it's mostly Ukrainians being reunited with family who already live in the United States, there's going to be an emphasis on dissidents, on journalists, on LGBTQ people who are Ukrainian, who may face threats to their own life and their existence for being who they are, but it's going to exceed that cap. Well, that, to me, in an election year is going to spark an interesting conversation, certainly among Democrats, and then probably among those who worry a lot about immigration, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And they'll say, look, you've kept a policy in place during the pandemic that has kept out hundreds of thousands of people from Mexico, Central America, and Haiti. You're struggling to figure out how many more people from Afghanistan you're going to let in after ending that war. And you, of course, remember that there are potentially thousands of people still in Afghanistan who were either hoping to or assured of safe passage to the United States. And now you're going to suddenly also admit 100,000 Ukrainians. Well, that's a Pandora's box in the tricky issue of immigration policy in the United States, even as, from a foreign policy perspective, they're trying to show the world that they're willing to bring in at least 100,000 when millions have been displaced, most of them so far in Poland, where he will head on Saturday. And he hinted there in his remarks something we've been hearing about, which is that he is likely to meet with Ukrainian refugees or those that are assisting them in Poland during his visit to that country. That's a visit designed to thank them for not only shouldering the humanitarian burden, but to demonstrate that the United States stands with one of the biggest countries in Eastern Europe that is now most directly threatened by the possibility that this spills over outside the borders of Ukraine. And so, you know, expect to hear more about this in the coming days. But I would think it will quickly become a domestic topic of debate if the administration is being so generous with Ukrainians. What about all these other groups that have been trying to get into the United States for so long?
Absolutely. Ed O'Keefe putting it all in perspective for us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ed. And we are going to take a quick break now, but we'll be right back with more news. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News.
Breaking news as it happens. CBS News New York on the CBS News app and Pluto TV.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey,